experiments show quite clearly in these laboratory rats under very carefully controlled conditions that you can make rats addicted to sugar. And if you look at their brains, they will show addiction-like changes if you give them very brief access to sugar following a period of essentially having no access to food. And also if you stop giving them sugar, the rats will show the rat equivalent of withdrawal symptoms. So I think there is very good evidence from these rat experiments that you can create the rat equivalent of sugar addiction. Now, human beings eat differently.
We certainly do, and while there may be similarities in human and rat brains, at the end of the day, rats are rats and not humans. Neurofast have also been looking at the complex relationship between gut and brain and the range of hormones involved in signalling satiety. In other words, feeling full.
The main way that the gut signals to the brain is via hormones. So hormones are substances, usually peptides in the case of the gut, that are released into the blood, and they're detected by the brain, and it allows the brain to monitor the metabolic status of the individual. There's some evidence to suggest that different types of food, so different patterns of macronutrient content, can result in different patterns of release of hormones. So the brain can, in a sense, detect what nutrients have been consumed during a meal. So that's essentially how the gut signals up to the brain.
In terms of food addiction, would it be right to say that if something is going wrong, it could be going wrong in the brain, it could be going wrong in the gut, or it could be going wrong somewhere in between, or in a combination of both?
My feeling is it's something happening in the brain.
For close to 20 years, we've been studying systematically the same processes that we had found abnormal in addiction. We have also now studied them in morbidly obese individuals.
One of the pioneers of research into the neuroscience of addiction to both drugs and eating is Nora Volkov, who runs the National Institute on Drug Abuse in the United States.
There are people that are more vulnerable to overconsumption of drugs, and there are people that are more vulnerable to overconsumption of food. And within the process of overconsumption of food, there are people that are more vulnerable to overconsumption of specific types of food. So there are individuals that favor fats and others that may be favoring carbohydrates. And in some instances, for example, the propensity to overconsume food can be understood, for example, by the genetic abnormality that leads to excessive consumption of food. You can see that the brain is hypersensitive to food.
That sensitivity is partly driven by a neurotransmitter in the brain called dopamine. It's implicated in addiction and compulsive eating, in aspects like lack of control, impulsivity, and feelings of pleasure, liking, and wanting. It's behind what scientists refer to as the reward pathway. Nora Volkov's neuroimaging work has revealed an intriguing similarity in levels of dopamine receptors, a type of brain cell which talks to dopamine, in both addicts and overeaters that may account for their lack of control and impulsive behaviour.
The first study that we did was to ask the question, are the deficit in dopamine receptors that we have been documented in the brain of addicted individuals also present in people that were morbidly obese? And what we found was that indeed they were. And what was very intriguing was that the lower the dopamine receptors in obese individuals, the more severe the obesity. And this was actually very intriguing because in addicted people, low levels of dopamine receptors are associated with poor self-control and impulsivity, which indicates that a common element in these two disorders, drug addiction and morbid obesity driven by excessive eating, is actually the improper control and regulation of the areas of the brain that are necessary for us to exert self-control. Is the equivalent of driving, I guess, without brakes.
Perhaps the most shameful thing that I've done was to basically steal food from an elderly woman who I was visiting as a sort of community service thing. Her memory was poor and I knew she would never find out, and I ate food out of her fridge because I couldn't stop myself.
If understanding control is crucial in food addiction, then so is understanding reward. When we seek reward, we move towards something which makes us feel good. But in drug addiction, drug taking soon becomes about relieving the symptoms of withdrawal. The reward now is the avoidance of anxiety, agitation, nausea, or worse. And this avoidance of the negative can be just as powerful as the chasing of the positive. Caitlin O'Hara is an eating disorders researcher at London's Institute of Psychiatry, specialising in the role of reward and dopamine.
Reward involves feelings of liking and pleasure and euphoria, as well as motivation. So motivated behavior, a pull towards accessing the reward. And it also involves learning, because at the beginning, you have to be able to learn the associations between these feelings of liking and the cues in the reward that bring on these feelings of liking. Nowadays, what research tends to say is that dopamine seems to be more involved in the motivational aspect of reward, producing a motivational pull towards obtaining and working for the rewards.
How would that translate into an actual behaviour in someone with an eating disorder?
One example they use quite frequently in the literature is someone who sees the golden arches of McDonald's. And the golden arches is the cue that signals reward, fires a signal in the brain, dopamine is released, and this produces that motivational pull subconsciously. It's not a conscious thing that happens, is pulled towards obtaining that reward, so food.
So this sounds like a sort of rather sophisticated and long drawn-out version of a Pavlovian reaction.
Yes, definitely. What dopamine is said to do is involved in the Pavlovian instrumental transfer. So it makes those Pavlovian associations able to be transferred into motivated behavior.
Neuroscientific evidence is lovely stuff, and we use it a lot when we look at alcohol and drug addiction. You get a nice picture of the brain with different areas lighting up, and it's hard to argue that nothing is happening when you can see that something is. The work of Nora and Caitlin is just a snapshot of what could be going on, but it's extremely compelling. However, there's a whole group of scientists who say this is not enough.
I think essentially addiction is a habit problem. A lot of people think it's got to be biological. One's got to pin it down to something that's going on in the brain, although I think some very interesting things are going on there. But essentially it's about the circumstances under which people develop powerful destructive habits.
We know that addiction can be thought of in ways that don't involve brain chemistry or structure, including learned responses, memory, and conditioning. It's when we come to looking at addictive behaviours that some of these ideas dominate. Perhaps looking for a food molecule to pin addiction on is too simplistic. What about the actual act of eating? That's a behaviour. Could the behaviour itself be addictive? Jim Orford is a psychologist at Birmingham University and was one of the first addiction researchers to explore whether not just substances, but behaviours such as gambling and sex could be addictive. 20 years ago, this idea would have been laughed out of the room, but now there's good evidence to support it.
One of the addictions that I've been very interested in for a long time is gambling. And when I was first interested in that, I felt I was fighting a bit of a losing battle to convince people that something that isn't a substance could actually be just as addictive as alcohol, other drugs. And most of the theories were about what substances did to the central nervous system, and that was the core idea of what addiction was. And I started to talk to people who had problems with gambling, and I was very struck by what they said, and it seemed to me that they were in fact describing addictions just like other addictions, and I was quite surprised. It raised all the questions about what was addiction. And then I started to read a certain amount about eating addiction, and I stumbled across growing literature on binge eating disorder, and I realised that there were lots of people who have those problems who describe what they have in terms of addiction. People will use the word addiction. They say, I'm addicted. This is like an addiction. It's like a drug.
sneaking it into the house, not wanting people to see how much I'm eating, in the same way that I would do with alcohol, hiding food. So I would buy food that was my binge food that I would hide in the back of the cupboard so that nobody else would eat it, just like as an alcoholic I would hide bottles, hiding the empties, hiding the wrappers, creating a row with my partner so that I can go off and buy alcohol, creating a row with my partner so I can go off and buy chocolate, not wanting to be in social situations, wanting to be on my own with my substance.